Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula. For the record, this movie should really be called Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, but we'll get into that as I go on to the video. But yeah, for Spooktober, as of recently, I've been really getting into some vampire movies. In the past 2 days, I've watched the Horror of Dracula, the Hammer horror film, the first Hammer horror film that I've actually seen with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And their first adaptation of Dracula. And I actually like that movie quite a bit. It's not perfect. Christopher Lee is barely in the movie, which is kind of a problem, but when he's in the movie, he's pretty fantastic and truly intimidating. So I liked it quite a bit. I rewatched Bela Lugosi's Dracula, which was the one that was my favorite as a kid. I hadn't seen it in a long time, but watching it now, there are some really wonderful, chilling photography and images in that movie. But man, there's also just long stretches of just nothing going on. And there's little to no music in the movie, like hardly at all, with the exception of like both the beginning and end of the film. And so, yeah, my love for that has dropped significantly because it drags quite a bit. And then the other vampire movie I watched, which has nothing to do with Dracula, is Guillermo del Toro's first movie, Cronos, which is streaming on HBO Max. I watched that for the first time. One of the more unique and original takes I've seen on a vampire, and I like that one quite a bit. I would definitely recommend that movie to Del Toro fans or anyone looking for kind of a unique cinematic take on vampires. But watching all these movies made me want to rewatch a movie that I've watched a lot, especially during this month, and that is Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of Dracula. This is a movie that I would call a flawed masterpiece in terms of visual storytelling, just in terms of the images and the atmosphere and the sets, the costumes, the visual effects, most of which are done almost entirely in camera, like a lot of old school movie making tricks are seen in this movie. On an overall technical aspect of this movie, I think it is one of the most brilliant I've ever seen. It's one of my favorite looking movies, and it's a movie that is just I would love to see on the big screen one day, actually. If they ever did a re-release of this movie and they restored the film and getting to see it on the big screen, I mean, this movie would be amazing to see on the big screen. But it is a movie that is flawed in more ways than one, and we'll get into that. But yeah, so the film is the story of Dracula, but one of the biggest differences between Coppola's version and Bram Stoker's version is that the center of the movie is really the love story between Dracula and Mina, or as Dracula believes, his reincarnated lover, Elisabetta. And that is something that is not in the book at all. I've never read the original Dracula book, and I'm not a Dracula expert by any means. I did a lot of reading about the making of this movie because I think it's one of the most interesting movies to see how it was made. And I was looking up a lot of the differences between this movie and the book. When you look at some of the behind the scenes of this movie, Francis Ford Coppola specifically talks about how he wanted to make a very faithful adaptation of the book. And there are a lot of details that are shown in Coppola's version of Dracula that are quite faithful to the source material, and that we've never seen in any other adaptation. I mean, this is the only Dracula film that I've seen. And that's the other thing that should be stated, is that there's been so many fucking Dracula movies that I think even the most hardcore Dracula fans have probably not seen every single adaptation, because when you look it up, it's staggering. Not just in terms of movies, but in terms of like made for television films and mini series. And I'm sure there's so many different obscure versions of Dracula that, you know, it's hard to keep track. But as far as Coppola's version, there are a lot of elements that are in his movie that I personally have never seen in any other Dracula adaptation. I mean, this is the only Dracula film where we see Dracula being able to turn into like a werewolf creature, being able to turn into a green mist, which is from the book, being able to turn into like a giant gargoyle man bat, which is super badass, and then being able to turn into rats. And like, this is one of the best Dracula adaptations to show the full power of Dracula. I mean, the guy's like nearly a god. But he doesn't have that many weaknesses. In fact, in this movie, and I'm not sure if this is accurate to the book or not, but in this movie, they show that when he's strong enough, when he's consumed blood and he's able to go back to his young self, he can walk around during the day. So this version of Dracula is definitely one of the more powerful versions of Dracula, and that should go right into Gary Oldman's performance, which is still my favorite performance of Dracula. It's I haven't seen a ton of Dracula movies, but this one is my favorite, and Gary Oldman is a big reason why. He is just an amazing actor. Everybody knows this. He has one of the widest ranges of an actor I've ever seen in my life. And this movie is just a glowing example of that. But he matches the tone of the film beautifully, much like this entire movie, which is, you know, very bombastic, very operatic, very larger than life. His performance matches the tone of the film so well. Both him and Anthony Hopkins are easily the standouts in this movie. Anthony Hopkins is one of those other actors where no matter what movie he's in, he's just captivating. And then one of the more underrated performances, in my opinion, I have to point this out because I'm a huge fan of his, and that is Tom Waits as Renfield. He's not in the movie a ton, but when he is so awesome. And I love Tom Waits in pretty much everything. Not just his acting, but I'm a big fan of his music as well. So there are certain performances in the movie that are terrific. And then we have to get into the most controversial aspect of Dracula. So controversial, in fact, that I feel like it almost overshadows this movie in terms of whenever people talk about this movie, they always have to bring this up. And that is Keanu Reeves' performance as Jonathan Harker in this film.
I've seen many strange things already. Bloody wolves chasing me through some blue inferno.
I love Keanu Reeves. We all know that he is a genuine person outside of being a fun movie star who's made iconic films. I mean, The Matrix, Point Break, Speed, and now the John Wick movies. I mean, I've seen all those movies almost an embarrassing amount of times. I love Keanu Reeves. Fucking Bill and Ted, that's my jam. But he isn't the most versatile actor in the world. I think that's fair to say. And it's just a classic case of him being miscast. Now, does he ruin the movie for me? No, because he's not the only flaw. I feel like when people talk about this version of Dracula, they almost solely bring up Keanu Reeves as if he is the biggest flaw in this movie and he makes the movie unwatchable. I don't think that's true. I think that's a bit overboard. I love Winona Ryder. I think she's awesome in most movies. In this movie, also, I don't think her performance is amazing. It's not as great as Gary Oldman, and it's not as terrible as Keanu Reeves. She's kind of somewhere in the middle. I think she does overall fine in the movie, but there are some scenes, especially between her and Gary Oldman, that don't fully work for me. And then we're going to get into the bigger flaws that I have with the movie personally. As much as I love the visuals and as much as I love the pacing and just the creativity of this movie, as much as I love all that stuff, it is a film that is a classic example of style over substance. There is an attempt to have substance there. There is an attempt to make Dracula a sympathetic character and to make the love between him and Mina genuine and beautiful and passionate. And it doesn't fully work for me. As far as Dracula being a sympathetic character, this is something that both the writer of the film and Francis Ford Coppola talk a lot about during the making of, which I watched. They talk about how they wanted to make Dracula a sympathetic character and not just a simple monster, which from what I understand, I've not read the book. In the book, he's pretty much just a straight up monster with little to no redeeming qualities at all. So I do like the idea of changing that and making him feel a little bit more complex. But as I'm watching the movie, I don't really ever feel that bad for Gary Oldman's version of Dracula. Like, yes, it's sad that the love of his life died and, he feels like he has to do all this terrible stuff to get her love back. But like, there are so many things he does throughout the movie that's like, I don't feel sympathy for this guy because he is a bad guy. Case in point, the scene where he, which is from the book, by the way, where he gives the baby to his vampire wives after them trying to seduce or / eat Keanu Reeves. How do you feel sympathy for a guy who does that? How do you feel sympathy for a guy who goes after this girl, Mina's friend, Lucy, turns into a werewolf, has sex with her, and then, turns her into a vampire and sucks her blood. And it's like, he does a lot of evil stuff that it's like, any chance there is to feel sympathy for him, there's too many monstrous stuff he does that takes all that away for me. So I don't ever truly feel sympathetic for Gary Oldman's version of Dracula in this movie. And the relationship he has with Mina, while it does have moments of passion and there's some great filmmaking around their romance together, I don't really feel personally that Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman have great chemistry. Some of it, or a lot of it, in my opinion, comes off as being a bit awkward, and it doesn't fully work for me. It's not terrible, and it's not a deal breaker by any means, but as I was watching all of these versions of Dracula, I watched these three adaptations of Dracula. All of them are flawed. All of the complaints I'm saying about Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, there are things that I can say about the previous ones that fall into the same category as well. It's like, I don't feel really emotionally involved in those Dracula movies either. I feel a little bit more emotionally involved in Coppola's version because at least there's an attempt there, and he's making it beautiful and tragic and larger than life. It's an attempt. It doesn't fully work for me, but it's better than the previous ones, because the previous ones, I don't think they even attempt to like develop their characters. They're kind of just there in the plot because the plot needs them to be. At least with Coppola's version, there's an attempt to give a little bit more heart in this version of Dracula, even if it doesn't fully work for me on an emotional level. On a visual level, it totally works for me. And, you know, Roger Ebert is one of my favorite film critics. He's a critic that I admire greatly. And even if I don't always agree with a lot of his reviews, the way he expresses himself and the way he gets his views across, I really admire. But he really nailed my feelings of this movie when he said in his review, "I enjoyed the movie simply for the way it looked and felt." That's exactly why I love this movie. I don't love this movie because I think the romance is really great, or I genuinely feel bad for Dracula in this movie. I don't. I love it because visually it is so unbelievable. It is so well made, and the tricks and the techniques that Coppola uses in this movie are like old school classic movie techniques of in-camera effects. And there's even a scene where he's using an old like camera from like the early 1900s. And the movie, when you look at the behind the scenes and how the movie is made, the movie on a technical level feels like a love letter to the art of filmmaking. That's where my appreciation of this movie really comes from, is the way it's made is so stunningly beautiful. And I love the vibe of the movie. I love how melodramatic it gets. I love how creepy it gets. It never really gets scary per se, but it definitely gets haunting with its imagery, and it does feel like an art house movie made for mainstream audiences, because there's a lot of weird choices made in this movie, but for me, they all pretty much totally work. And also the score to this movie is so amazing, and it fits the tone of the film just as well. It adds so much to the atmosphere, adds so much to just the overall feel and vibe of the movie. So the score, much like the visuals, are just stunning, and it just creates a really intoxicating viewing experience. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, guys. Tell me what you think of this movie. Do you like it? Do you love it? Are you like me, where you think it's a masterpiece in terms of visual storytelling, but is flawed in terms of some of the story beats? Mention it in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching.